All right. I am coming to you from the front seat of my wife's vehicle, her Escape again. Um, I thought I'd put together just a quick how-to on just some diagnosis on an EGR system. Um, this system on the Escape is a vacuum-operated EGR valve, which means it's got a EGR vacuum regulator that's electronically duty cycled on to get a variable vacuum applied to the valve to open the valve to different points. This is a unique to Ford system. They use what's called a DPFE sensor. The DPFE stands for differential pressure feedback EGR. So basically, in the EGR tube, somewhere in the EGR tube, there's an orifice that's welded in or pinched into the tube, crushed into the tube, so that there's an orifice. Again, on the intake side, it's got engine vacuum. On the exhaust side, it's got exhaust pressure. And that little orifice creates a differential point where when you open the EGR valve, you start allowing vacuum that's going to start to build downward towards that orifice. And then on the other side of the orifice will be the exhaust pressure. And so it's using a pressure sensor to measure the difference in pressure between the two sides to determine how much EGR is actually flowing in the system. So that's just a kind of a unique to Ford thing, how they are showing how they're making sure that system actually functions and flows exhaust gases into the intake for the EGR function. EGR function, the sole purpose of it again is for controlling NOx emissions. So I'm just going to go through a quick how-to, or kind of show you how the system works, how I can control a couple of things. Quick EGR test to show me whether this was working or not, if I had an actual EGR code, which I don't on this one. This would be one of the test processes that I go through to test that system to see if it's working. So with Ford, with aftermarket scan tools, you would be looking at like an active test or special tests or something of that nature. With Ford, we do it in the PID monitor system, which again with the Ford IDS, which I'm using that because that's what I have at home to do this with right now. But we're going to go into data logger. And then, like I said in my previous video, the only one I've done so far, anything that has a little pound sign, or for the young crowd, a hashtag by it, is something that we can take command of and control. So what I'm going to do real quick here is I'm going to pull this up, and again it comes up with a whole bunch of stuff. I'm going to go through here and I'm going to pick the ones that I want that are relevant just to this EGR. So again, DPFE sensor. That's the sensor that Ford uses to monitor this system. So we want the DPFE, and then I need so I've got several different EGRs. I've got EGR, VR percent, and of course if I hover my mouse over this button, it tells me down here a description of what that PID is. So that says EGR vacuum regulator duty cycle, and that is the one that I want. Just for fun, also, Ford's not necessarily going to use this, but I'm going to pop the map sensor too, just so that we can see that. And let's hit the two upstream oxygen sensor. So upstream oxygen sensor, and like I said before, I always like to watch the voltage. So 1 is bank 1. Sensor 1 is before the catalytic converter. Sensor 2, 1, 2 would be bank 1 after catalytic converter. So I want 2, 1, which is bank 2 sensor 1. And I just want to hit those just so that we can see a fault. On this one, I want RPM. And this one does have idle air control still. So I'm going to take the idle air control. Because when we do this, we're going to get the engine's going to stumble and do some weird things. So I want to kick the RPMs up so that it doesn't die on me and we can actually activate that EGR valve and see the results without it killing the engine. So we'll select those, we'll get those going. Oh, why did this put this up here? Because I selected the wrong one. See, I'm not watching. I don't want mode, I want volts. Okay, so we'll pull this up, get this going. So the EGR valve, I'm going to pull a couple of these. So I got my DPFE sensor. This is the sensor that's used to monitor. Most of the time with Fords, when it's sitting, just idling, there's no EGR being commanded. That thing should be right around 1 volt. Some of them are a little lower than 1 volt, but should be right around 1 volt. This one is the EGR vacuum regulator. Again, the pound sign, which means I can control it. The idle air control, that's the valve that controls the idle. That one's also got a pound sign by it, which is why I chose that. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to take control of the idle air control, and I'm going to leave it right where it's at because I'm sitting at about 1200 RPMs. Let's kick it up just a little higher. So if I hit the plus, see the RPMs will now went to about 1370. Yeah, that's better. I like that. Okay, most vehicles, most manufacturers are going to use the map sensor as one of the sensors that they use to detect EGR flow. Again, Ford uses this, but pay attention as I do this. Watch that map sensor voltage too, and we'll see that map sensor voltage change as I command some EGR on. Okay, so I'm going to go back here. I'm going to take control of the EGR valve. You see that change to an equal sign, which means it has relinquished control to me. So I have control of that EGR valve. So as I turn this on, usually I won't see anything happen as I hit, as I turned it, and we've got 10% there. Usually you don't see anything happening until you hit about 20 to 25%, and this is going to jump in 10% increments. So if I hit 20, probably won't see any change. But when I hit 30, usually it starts to change. So I should see multiple reactions. The main one with Fords that I'm looking for is the DPFE voltage should start to go up. Also, map sensor voltage should change, and we should see the oxygen sensors kind of lean a little bit as I open this up. So I'm going to open it another step, and no change. Oh, there we go. I can hear it now. All of a sudden now we're at 2 volts here. We see the little momentary change here, and we see the map sensor voltage has changed a bit too. As I command that on farther, now I can hear the engine's really starting to stumble. See the RPMs have dropped. DPFE sensor. Again, that voltage has spiked way up, and the map sensor voltage is changing too. And the map sensor is what a lot of the manufacturers are going to be looking at as the indicator of EGR. So again, this is a functioning EGR system. Let's command that even more. 100%. Now it's running like crap. So EGR voltage maxed out. Actually, if I goose the throttle a little bit, well, we might see that get into the 4s. There's a little bit of a 4. As I change the throttle, map sensor voltage changes. Oxygen sensors are freaking out. So this is a working EGR system. If I had an insufficient flow, what would happen is, as if I was having a code that said insufficient flow. Then as I open this up, I wouldn't see a change. So let's back this off. So I'm going to go over here, I'm going to hit minus, and I'm going to back this down. And we should see the voltage should start to drop a little bit. There it goes. On DPFE, voltage dropped just a little bit. Drop it again. Dropped a little more, quite a bit more. 1 volt, map sensors coming back. Oxygen sensors being a little weird. And then we get it to off. Now we're back to 0.99 volts. EGR's is 0. Map sensor's back about where it was at 130. So this would be a functioning. What I would expect if I had a malfunctioning is, as I commanded this on, there would be no change here on the DPFE sensor. There would be no change on the map sensor. And at the same time, I probably would not hear the engine stumble. Now, if it were just a sensor problem, which this is something that's a little bit common to Fords, is this DPFE sensor malfunctions. So what I would see in that case is I would see the EGR valve, as I command the vacuum regulator on, I would hear the engine start to stumble and die, but there would be no voltage change on that DPFE sensor. So if the engine is stumbling and dying, but there's no change on the EGR, or on the DPFE sensor, then that would tell me, okay, the vacuum is working, the valve is opening, we're getting exhaust gases going in there, but the sensor just can't monitor it. So that would indicate an error with the sensor, and you'd probably be looking at replacing the sensor at that point. So again, one of the main keys, one of the most important things that so many people fail on when they're diagnosing in the EGR system is one of the very first steps that I always do when I'm diagnosing an EGR system is I will either sit in the car like this with the scan tool and command that EGR on, and I expect the RPMs to stumble and die, to stumble and possibly engine die. Actually, let me release control of these. I would expect them to I would expect the engine to stumble and die. If it doesn't change at all, then we've either got a vacuum problem or we've got a plugged EGR system. So many times I see a plugged EGR system come into the shop, and every single piece, it's got a new valve, it's got a new DPFE sensor, it's got new DPFE sensor hoses, it's got probably a new EGR tube, it's got, I mean, everything, the EGR vacuum regulator, everything has been replaced. But nobody bothered to actually command the valve open to see if you actually get EGR flow. So I'll stick a vacuum pump on, open the valve manually with a vacuum pump, no change in RPMs, engine doesn't stumble. You got plugged EGR passages. Very common misdiagnosed problem. You go to one of the local parts houses, they read your codes and they sell you parts. They're making money when they sell you parts. They don't diagnose, they sell parts. So you can replace all the parts on the thing, but if you have a plugged EGR passage, you're not going to fix the problem. So do be aware of that. Alright, so that's just some quick explanation on diagnosing EGR. Always one of the very first steps I do whenever I diagnose EGR, we've got to command that EGR valve on, preferably with a scan tool. If I can't do it with a scan tool, somehow I'm going to go and electrically open that EGR valve, or if it's a vacuum controlled EGR valve, put your little hand vacuum pump on it and crack that valve wide open and see if the engine stumbles. Let's make sure we can get flow through the EGR system, and make sure it flows EGR before we go spending too much time diagnosing the sensors and all that. Alright, so what I'm going to do, this is my wife's escape. I'm going to jump over to We'll see. I may or may not do this. I'm going to jump over to my car. It's got an electric EGR valve, a stepper motor type EGR valve. It's done through the head and all that. I'm going to jump in that. I haven't played with that one as much. I'm going to jump in that, see if I can command it and see what happens. If I get a good reaction, I'll do a short clip on that too. So, exit out of this. And I'll be back as soon as I switch cars. Alright, I'm back. I'm in my car now. 2010 Ford Fusion, 2.5 liter. Big powerful 4-cylinder. Anyways, so I already kind of set this up, got this ready to go. This is a different system. If I go back over here to what we can select, what you actually see here is you actually see for PIDs that you can monitor EGR. This is motor control 1 fault. So this is a stepper motor. It's got 4 different kind of electric solenoids in it that make the motor turn in like 90-degree increments. So they energize number 1, it turns at 90 degrees, they energize number 2, it turns at another 90 degrees, 3, 90 degrees, 4, 90 degrees, then it would go back and re-energize that. So if you had a fault in one of those circuits, then it would indicate here. I'll pick them just so you can see. They'll just say no fault across the top of the screen. EGR percent. Let's pick that one too. So EGR stepper motor. This is a stepper motor. This is what it's commanded. You see the little pound sign next to it, so that means I can control it. This one, Ford doesn't put the DPFE on it, so they're just simply using the map sensor, and they'll kind of watch current. This is an air-fuel ratio sensor. It's not a regular oxygen sensor, so it doesn't have a voltage PID that we're used to seeing. Okay, so we don't have the traditional oxygen sensor, but we should still see some basic change. You see that oxygen sensor, the current's just moving just a little bit, hanging a little bit one way. We see our map pressure in PSI here, EGR step. See, and these ones just say no faults. And this one will tell us how much percentage it's open. So EGR step, that's what I can control, so I'm going to click on that. Again, I'm going to hit the pound sign, which says I want to take control. The little button says now I'm in control. We see it change to equal here. So as I increase this, we should see the RPM start to struggle. Mostly we're going to watch the map sensor on this one. We should see the map sensor voltage change. Or excuse me, this one's in PSI. So we should see that pressure change. Manifold absolute pressure. So as we start allowing EGR in there, it should have less vacuum inside of the engine, so we should see a map sensor voltage change. So as I command this up, there it goes. I can feel the engine's just starting to run a little bit rough. Starting to see a little bit of reaction and a little bit of roughness here. Crack this open a couple more. You'll see when you initially switch, that oxygen sensor will have an initial reaction, but then it'll kind of walk back to about the 0, which is where it should. But you see that the RPM is running rough. Now we've changed over 2 PSI on this sensor. As I crack that open more, it's running even rougher. It's almost dying. So again, what I'm seeing is as I turn the EGR valve on, it's allowing exhaust gases into the intake. It's making the engine run really bad, which is why we have this really struggle here, the varied RPM. And we really are watching on this system, we're watching the map sensor. Does the map sensor voltage change? it is changing, which tells me, okay, the EGR valve is being commanded on. It actually physically opened. It's causing the engine to run rough, and we're seeing a voltage change here. So if I were commanding that on and I saw no change, then I would have suspect, again, just like with the other one, I would suspect restricted EGR passage. But this one is working good. Let's turn this off, and it should normalize. Go back to 0. Now again, we're back down to 4. We were up to 10, which I should have vacuum reading differently. Shouldn't be reading in PSI. Should be reading in inches of vacuum. I think I have something set up wrong on my tool. Anyways, so RPM has pretty well stabilized. You see a much flatter line here. Map pressure went back to normal. So again, most important thing when we're diagnosing an EGR system, number one most important thing, command that system on. Either if it's a vacuum system, command it on with grab a hand vacuum pump, open that valve. Does the engine stumble and die, or die? At a minimum, it should start running really, really bad. That's the indication that the EGR system can flow. So again, very common misdiagnosed problem with EGR systems is we never command the EGR system on, so we don't know that the system is restricted. We just start replacing parts. Okay, and that's partly what I'm trying to train people not to do. Alright, hope you found this interesting. If you do, make sure you like it. Give me a like, subscribe to my YouTube channel, all that stuff. Alright.